Last month I did a video outlining what I enjoyed about story games. In that video, I promised that I'd take a look at gameplay as well, talking about what I really enjoy in games from a gameplay perspective. As I've thought about how to approach this subject, I realized that there were two ways that came to mind. The first was to look at specific mechanics and genres and talk about them. I'm not sure that this would work the best since I tend to like a wide variety of genres and mechanics in games. I may be interested in looking at some of these genres or mechanics in separate smaller videos, but to try to list all the ones I enjoy here might be a bit unwieldy. That leaves the second option, to step back and look at larger systems and how important those aspects of gameplay are to me. I think this will be a little easier to approach in a video like this, even if it is taking a rather wide angle when it comes to gameplay. Like my story video, I'm trying to stick these in order of importance, starting with the most important and moving to the least important for me. Like my video on story, I'm not claiming that this list will be exhaustive. These are just the big systems that came to mind about gameplay. And like story, I know that what people like about gameplay probably varies widely. This is just what I like the most, and to be honest, I'm sure that some of these move around in importance depending on the game. With all of that said, let's get to the list. So at the top of what I think is most important in gameplay is a sense of progression. If a game is going to be enjoyable for me, then I need to have a sense that I am making progress in some way in that game. Some of you might be like, well, what does that even look like? And in some ways, I find it kind of hard to fully explain, mainly because I think it depends on the type of game that I'm playing, what that progression looks like. So I'm going to give a few examples that kind of shows how progression works in a few different types of games that I like to play. In games that involve live service, take Fortnite, for example. This is about how the game implements the various progression systems it includes. Is the battle pass or season pass or whatever you want to call it decent to accomplish, or is it a ridiculous grind that you feel like playing that game is almost like having a second job to be able to complete the battle pass by the end of the set season? Or take a game like Destiny. Are the loot systems in game good at making you feel like you're getting stronger, or are you going long periods of time without finding a weapon to increase your power, making the grind not feel worth the incremental power increase? To change games that aren't necessarily always online, if it's a game that involves gaining levels, so like an open world adventure game or an RPG, the focus then becomes more on how long does it take for you to level up, and do the levels feel like they're actually making you stronger and progressing you in the game? Do levels feel like they're just there to get you to grind and extend game length, or are they used in such a way to make you feel like you're progressively getting stronger as you progress through the game, that the actions you're taking in game are just naturally making you stronger because you're going through the various events in that game's story? There's also the Souls-like genre, and asking the questions of how does progression feel here? Are there systems that allow you to become stronger? Are the gameplay mechanics fair and well balanced and then make you feel like you're gaining mastery over the abilities in the game regardless of whatever kind of power increase systems they have as well? And these are the kind of things that I'm talking about here. It's about feeling like you're getting better or progressing in a game. While I don't mind some grinding every once in a while in games for various reasons, I also need to feel like the grind isn't inflated and just there to make you feel like you're playing the game for longer. Or if it's a game that constantly has you restarting at the beginning, which roguelikes tend to have this mechanic going on, I need to feel like there is some way of getting stronger. Either really tight controls that allow you to increase your mastery and you get better each time because you kind of know what to expect, or systems in the game that help increase your strength and ability to live longer and get further in the game the next time. If things are there just to kind of stretch a 10-hour game into a 30-hour game, then it's gonna hurt my opinion of the game, because I don't necessarily want games to be ballooned out much more than they really need to be. I want games to take our time as people who play them seriously. There are already so many games out there, so I find very little need to add all sorts of padding to a game when a leaner experience where you're feeling the progression go smoothly is so much more satisfying. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have side quests, you can't have side content or things like that that are going on in your game, but just make it not feel like it's just padding that's there to increase the amount of time you can say people are playing your game. The second aspect of gameplay is the controls. I was torn torn about whether to stick controls at number 1 or not. And to be honest, this is probably very, very close to a sense of progression in terms of importance for me. While a bad sense of progression can ruin a game with good controls, a game with bad controls can really make a game hard to get through, even if the systems for progression aren't terrible. I guess I generally feel that if a game has pretty poor feeling controls, it's likely that the other parts of the game are probably fairly rough as well. So that's kind of why I stuck it here, is because I feel like controls are usually pretty decent in most games, and that when it doesn't go well, there's other parts that are just going to be failing as well. I feel like controls are a very important aspect of gameplay. They are the foundation for actually playing the game. And in general, I feel that most games, as I said, have at least competent controls, but there are many ways for controls to feel bad to people. It could just have bad controls that feel laggy or unresponsive. Some games do have these issues. They aren't maybe the majority of games, but every once in a while you have ones where controls just are not good. And I'm not even talking about going back and playing older games that have like the tank controls in third person mode. Like, those are just kind of a product of their era, and while they may feel terrible to us today, they were a step in the right direction towards what we have now. I'm more talking about games that just have bad controls. Now, sometimes what gets called bad controls are just our preferences. For example, like platformers. Some have very precise jumping and controls like that, whereas others have more of a floaty style of jumping. Now, we might have a preference on these, but it doesn't necessarily make one control style bad. They just maybe aren't what we would enjoy. There is also the aspect of how well the controls are communicated. If the game has complicated controls, does the game do a good job of communicating those controls to you? If you step away from the game for any length of time, is it easy to look up those controls again to refresh your memory? It may be a game that controls really well, but doesn't do a great job of communicating some of the more complex aspects of its control scheme, and therefore have many players not utilizing the full set of tools that the game is trying to give them. There are also the games that just decide to try to be different for no real good reason. The games that basically say, jump is this button in pretty much every other game, not in this one. You mean you normally use the trigger button to shoot? We're gonna change that up. These games can sometimes be a bit frustrating because they make their control scheme different than most of the games of that similar genre. This is okay if the game allows you to customize your control settings, but can be real frustrating to try to get used to if you can't change things around. And the big question I have is, why do some games do this? I don't really understand the practice myself. Maybe it's a way to try to stand out. Maybe they just weren't thinking about it, but it's always a weird thing when you run into a game that decides to do things significantly different in terms of the control scheme. Controls are just so important, as they're what allow you to play the game. If you can get these top two issues together, the sense of progression and the controls, then for me, you've probably got a game that I will at least enjoy a decent amount. How much may vary, since story is also a thing and other gameplay elements do factor in, but on the gameplay side, these are definitely my two most important factors. But let's move on to some of the others that are a bit less important to me, but still things I notice in a game. And the third is the world. I know that I mentioned world in my story video. However, when I mentioned it there, I also talked about how the world the game takes place in feels just as much, if not more sometimes, a part of the gameplay as it does the story. While I feel like the story is the information about the world and how it connects to and serves as a backdrop to the events we're playing through, how we interact with that world is mostly through the gameplay. What kind of world are we exploring? Is it an open world or more of a linear one? Do we even get to explore the world, or is it a game that focuses more on the activity you're doing in the game? Think Rock Band 4 or Bloons TD6. The world is there, but there isn't really much of an exploration of said worlds. The most may be picking the city you're touring in or the level to defend against the balloons. This leads to the question of what kind of abilities are we given to explore said worlds? If the world is an open world, are there fast travel locations? Are there vehicles or other means of transportation to get around the world? If we have to climb up mountains or things like that, is there the ability to free climb like in Breath of the Wild or Genshin Impact? Or are there kind of set climbing paths to guide how you get to higher locations like in Horizon Zero Dawn? If you're playing a Metroidvania game, are there good skills that help you traverse the map, and how do they fit with the world that you're interacting with? You get all these kind of questions of how are we traveling in this world that we're existing in, and how does that mesh with the world that is being presented to us? There is the idea of like, how do we interact with this world? Are there quests for you to accomplish throughout the game? There are items or abilities to find that allow you to explore more of the world, new weapons that give you new strategies to face the enemies in that game. So there's just all these aspects that kind of go into how you're interacting with the world that's presented that can impact the gameplay. The plethora of ways that you can interact with the world, from traversal to combat and all those kind of things, can really be an interesting aspect of gameplay as you're traveling through that world. It can also be something that can break your enjoyment of the world and be frustrating if the elements really kind of clash, or there's certain things that just don't fit in your interactions with the world. So I kind of find it being one that's kind of in the middle. It's definitely not one of the most important for me. The fourth is menus and UI. While the previous category is about how you're interacting with the world in kind of a real time, menus and UIs are about kind of how you're interacting as the player who gets to kind of see the behind the scenes information and the menus to navigate and all that kind of stuff. And in general, I don't tend to be too fussy about menus and UI, but when they aren't done well, it can be really frustrating to navigate and really easy to notice that there's some major flaws going on. I know this was one of the issues that I had with Marvel's Avengers. The menus were just super confusing to figure out even from the start of the game, and trying to figure out, well, what do I need to do to get the story started? And that to me was not a very good start to the game. When your menus are sending you down the wrong path to start out, that's a pretty big issue in my eyes. I mean, to be honest, I do think I tend to have more issues with menus than I do with UI in most games. I can't really think of any game right off the top of my head where UI has been a source of frustration to me, but it seemed like something that should go with the menu system. I know there are some UIs out there that are less than stellar, but recently the games that I've been playing have all had fairly decent UIs. Navigating menus where it is difficult to find exactly what you want, or just take multiple steps to get to in the first place, can really get old, especially if it is a game that requires you to do this a lot. It is constantly sending you back to the menus. While I admit that I do tend to like organization in general, I'm generally not wanting to spend half of my time playing, trying to manage my inventory, whether it's selling items because it's full, or I'm needing to see how many of a certain item I have to collect to complete a quest or craft some item in the game. This gets particularly bad if a game has lots and lots of resources. I know it was a struggle I had with Horizon Zero Dawn. There were lots of different resources to find, but limited bag space. This meant that after a while, I continually had to find items to drop or sell, and it just became a little frustrating and a constant interruption to the flow of the game. I didn't think the menus necessarily were terrible in Horizon Zero Dawn. The game just constantly sent you to the menus, and that's just really not a great gameplay choice in my opinion. Personally, I'm a big fan with menus that are simple and easy to navigate and don't require you to have to go back to them regularly. I feel like this was a big strength of the Marvel Spider-Man series of games. Menus were quick and easy, and while there were resources to collect, there were very few of them, and they were used across many of the upgrades in the game, and it just all seemed to go quick and easy and flowed really well. About the only thing I think I went many times in the menu for was the map, which I view that as a little bit of a different thing, because trying to figure out where you are is something that I need to do fairly regularly. All this to say that I find good menus and UI to be something I don't always notice when done well, but can become very frustrating, time consuming, and just break up the game a little too much if they're done poorly, or at least have frustrating elements. Having systems that are able to give you good information and allow you to use the mechanics of the game without a lot of messing around and navigating menus is much better than having menus that are complicated, hard to navigate, and require entering into regularly for reasons that aren't very fun or don't even really feel super necessary in the larger scheme of the game. And lastly, I have complexity and explanation of systems. Now, I'm sure the idea of complexity initially makes you think that I'm against games that are complex, and that's not exactly what I mean here, and that's kind of why I added the explanation of systems as part of what I'm talking about here. Because I'm more talking about how complexity in a game is handled. Mainly two ways come to mind on this. Does the level of complexity fit the game, and is that complexity presented presented in an understandable way. Looking at the first question, it isn't that complexity is bad, but more looking at whether the complexity fits the game. There are plenty of games that are in the strategy, puzzle, management, and probably other genres I'm not thinking about that one would expect a certain level of complexity, more so than other genres out there. While sometimes even these games can be maybe too complex, it's not just that it's complex that's the issue. I'm more talking about games that have systems that are more complex than they need to be. Coming back to Horizon Zero Dawn, its inventory and crafting systems were more complex than I felt like they really needed to be. The game had too many types of material, and it wasn't always super clear which ones you needed to keep a hold of and which ones you could get rid of easily. It wasn't that the system was super complex, but it was more complex than it really needed to be. It made that aspect of the game feel a bit off and not that much fun for me. The second question, is that complexity presented in an understandable way, is more focused on how well the game does at presenting its systems to you. Think about chess. At its basics, it is a simple game. Each piece moves a certain way, and your goal is to take the opponent's king. But the complexity is about knowing how best to move and how to anticipate your opponent's move. It's a simple system, but hard to be good at and even harder to master. Games that throw a lot of terms at you, but not a good explanation of how those terms function or interact in the game or what they do for you, can be hard to get into. Also, there are games that try to front end a lot of these things by having early tutorials in the forms of classrooms or things like that. I know that Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VI had areas like this, and I didn't find these very helpful because many of the things that they're trying to explain early on aren't actually accessible or even happening for a good portion of the game. And many people aren't going to remember some of those very well by the time that they're actually relevant and happening in the game. And while you could maybe go back to these places, then that just adds like a whole element of the game that you have to backtrack and find your way back to this place that explains what these things do and how you use them, and it just doesn't feel the best. Now, this is the lowest on my list because with the internet, you can often find places to help you understand game systems or what certain stats are or various things like that. But with poor explanations of your systems in game, you're probably going to lose those who aren't interested in having to research how best to play the game. And these are my top 5 things that I think are important when it comes to gameplay in general. As I said, all of these are pretty broad categories that will hit a number of games and a number of genres, but all of these are kind of ones that I think are overall important. The first two are definitely the biggest in my opinion, having a good sense of progression and having good controls, but all of these can play a role in how much I like the gameplay of a certain game. What about you? What do you look for in your gameplay? Any things that you hold important that I didn't think of mentioning? Feel free to let me know in the comments, as I do enjoy continuing the conversation on these issues with you there. That's all for this video though, so I'll see you in the next one.